He sat in the chair, a tangle of wires strapped across his chest, sensors gripping his fingertips, a blood pressure cuff tightening around his arm. Chris Watt's husband, father, oil field worker, was about to take a polygraph test. The room was plain, almost sterile. A table, 2 chairs, a few documents neatly stacked. Nothing about it screamed drama. Yet what was about to unfold inside those 4 walls would become one of the most iconic moments in true crime history. Chris tried to smile. It was the smile of a man who wanted to appear cooperative, who wanted to sell the image of innocence. He even insisted that he would pass the test, as though saying out loud could will it into existence. But behind the faint grin, his body betrayed him. His eyes blinked too fast. His fingers twitched. His breathing hitched beneath the elastic band strapped across his chest. Polygraphs are not magic. They don't read minds. They don't detect lies with perfect accuracy. What they measure are betrayals of the body, the way a pulse quickens when words don't match reality, the way sweat glands fire when stress creeps in, the way breathing stutters when guilt presses down. Courts may reject them as unreliable, but in interrogation rooms, their power is undeniable. They don't just test suspects, they break them. Chris Watts walked into that room believing he could beat the system. He thought that if he controlled his breathing, stayed calm, and stuck to his script, he could outsmart both the machine and the people running it. He thought he could keep his secrets buried. But within hours, he would be slumped in that same chair, his facade cracked, his mask slipping, his carefully rehearsed lies unraveling in real time. This is the story of that day, the day the polygraph broke Chris Watts. Setting the stage. August 13th, 2018. A quiet suburban street in Frederick, Colorado, came alive with a mystery that would soon grip the nation. Shattering Watts, 34 years old, pregnant with her 3rd child, had returned home from a business trip just after 2 in the morning. A friend had dropped her off, watched her step inside her house, and driven away. It was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. By late morning, concern had begun to spread. Shattering wasn't answering texts. She missed a doctor's appointment. Calls went unanswered. For Shattering, this was unusual. She was known to be constantly in touch with friends and family, especially given her thriving career in a multi-level marketing company. Her absence from communication was the first red flag. Nicole Atkinson, her close friend, decided something was wrong. Nicole drove to the Watts home, knocked on the door, rang the bell. No answer. She called Chris, who claimed Shattering had taken the girls to a playdate. But Nicole wasn't convinced. She knew Shattering, she knew her routines, and she knew the silence didn't fit. Finally, Nicole called the police. When officers arrived, Chris appeared. He was calm, almost too calm. He offered explanations. Shattering had gone out. She might be at a friend's. Maybe she was just upset. He invited them inside. The officers looked around and found Shanann's purse, her phone, her medication. Her car sat in the garage. The signs pointed not to a planned departure, but to something else, something darker. That same day, Chris gave interviews to local news stations. Standing on his driveway, arms crossed tightly across his chest, he pleaded for his family's safe return. He spoke wanting them home, of hoping they were safe. Yet his tone was flat, his body language stiff. He rocked back and forth as he spoke, glancing away from the cameras. Neighbors watching the footage felt uneasy. One would later tell police, "He's not acting right." Behind the scenes, detectives began digging into the Watts' lives. They examined Shanann's phone, uncovering texts that revealed cracks in the marriage. Shattering confided in friends about Chris growing distant, about her fear that he no longer loved her. The picture-perfect family she displayed on social media was hiding a marriage in trouble. Investigators soon discovered Chris was having an affair with a coworker. Suddenly, the motive began to take shape. Still, suspicion alone wasn't enough. The police needed something to confront Chris with, something that would push him beyond his calm, rehearsed exterior. They canvassed the neighborhood, speaking to residents, and one neighbor provided critical footage from a security camera. The video showed Chris backing his work truck into the garage early that morning, a highly unusual act. He was seen making multiple trips back and forth, loading items. The neighbor told officers, "He's acting weird. He never does that." The suspicion sharpened into focus. Chris was no longer just a worried husband. He was a prime suspect. Detectives had a choice. They could press him with circumstantial evidence and hope he cracked, or they could employ a different tactic, the polygraph. For most guilty suspects, the suggestion is enough to make them refuse. They claim the test is unreliable. They insist on a lawyer. They shut the conversation down. But Chris surprised them. He said yes. His agreement was not the move of a calculated mastermind. It was the move of a man who believed too much in his own ability to perform. Chris thought he could trick the machine the same way he thought he had tricked his neighbors and the media. He thought he could control his body, steady his breath, hide his nerves. He thought he could win. What he didn't realize was that the polygraph was not a scientific trap. It was a psychological one. The machine was secondary. The real power lay in what would happen afterward, when detectives could look him in the eye and say, "You failed." In that moment, whether or not the science was perfect, the psychological weight would be unbearable. Chris Watts was about to walk into a room where his mask would finally break. The test begins. The door to the small interrogation room shut with a soft click, sealing Chris Watts into a space that felt at once ordinary and suffocating. Beige walls, fluorescent lights humming above, a table with wires neatly coiled. Nothing about the room seemed extraordinary. And yet for Chris, this would be the stage on which his carefully crafted image began to unravel. Tammy Lee, the polygraph examiner, entered the room with a calm smile. She carried no air of hostility, no harshness in her tone. Instead, she spoke with a gentle reassurance that disarmed rather than threatened. "I know nobody really likes these things," she said lightly, "but this is just a way to clear things up." Her words floated across the table like an invitation. To Chris, desperate to appear cooperative, they sounded safe. He nodded quickly, lips tightening into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The setup began. Tammy moved deliberately, narrating each step, the clinical routine doubling as a psychological prelude. "This band will measure your breathing," she explained, looping the elastic strap snugly around his chest. Chris inhaled sharply, the first betrayal of nerves. "This cuff measures your blood pressure," she continued, wrapping it around his arm. He shifted uncomfortably as the Velcro tightened. "And these sensors on your fingers measure sweat levels." Cold metal plates clipped onto his fingertips, making him flinch almost imperceptibly. Each attachment wasn't just a physical restraint, it was a reminder that his body was no longer his alone. Every breath, every beat of sweat will be captured. Chris tried to hide his discomfort, but his body betrayed him. His breathing came shallow, then uneven as he tried to force a rhythm. He rubbed his palms along his thighs, leaving faint, damp streaks, only for sweat to return seconds later. His eyes blinked rapidly, as though his lids were betraying the panic behind them. For anyone watching the footage later, the signs were unmistakable. But even in the room, Tammy could sense the dissonance. On the surface, Chris looked calm. His voice was low and steady. He smiled faintly at her jokes. But the stiffness of his posture, the constant self-soothing gestures, the quivering corners of his mouth revealed the truth. This was not the calm of innocence. It was the rigidity of a man performing a role, rehearsing a script, holding himself together with fragile threads. The questioning began with the basics, the baseline. "Is your name Chris?" He answered quickly, "Yes." "Are you sitting down?" Another quick, "Yes." "Are we in Colorado?" "Yes." For him, these were victories, proof that he could handle the test. For Tammy, they were data points, establishing the rhythms of his body when telling the truth. Even then, the machine recorded subtle spikes, a heart rate edging higher, breathing that stumbled briefly before recovering. His body was braced for what was coming. Then came the real questions. "Do you know where Shannon is?" There was a pause. Barely half a second, but enough. "No," he answered softly, eyes darting downward. His chest rose sharply against the band, his breathing catching. The needle twitched across the chart. Did you cause her disappearance? Another pause, longer this time. No. His lips pressed tightly after the word, sealing it like a secret. Sweat pooled at his temples. His hand flexed in his lap. Did you harm your children in any way? The question hung heavier than the rest. Chris swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. He licked his lips, then finally whispered, "No, the machine spiked." His pupils widened. His breathing faltered again. Tammy leaned back slightly, letting silence settle. Silence is not neutral in interrogation. It demands to be filled. Chris fidgeted in it, nervous chuckles slipping out small, inappropriate laughs that only amplified the tension. To Tammy, and to millions of viewers later, those chuckles were chilling. They were not signs of humor, but of stress cracking through the surface. She circled back, repeating questions with subtle changes in phrasing. Did Shannon do something to the girls, and you're covering for her? Are you being truthful when you say you don't know where they are? The technique was deliberate. Innocent people answer consistently, no matter how many times they're asked. Guilty people dread repetition. Each new version of the question forces them to reconstruct a lie, align it with what they said before, and deliver it convincingly. It is exhausting. Chris grew weaker with each cycle. His denial slowed, his voice softened, his eyes dropped more frequently. His gestures multiplied. He rubbed his forehead, ran a hand through his hair, shifted his posture as though the chair itself was attacking him. He licked his lips so often that the skin around them reddened. He swallowed audibly before key questions, as if forcing the lies down his throat. The sensors recorded everything: sweat surging, pulse rising, breath uneven. His body screamed what his words refused to admit. By now, the weight of the test was visible in Chris's face. The faint smile that had greeted Tammy at the beginning was gone. His lips pressed into thin lines between answers. His jaw clenched as though it took effort just to form the word no. His eyes darted down or away, rarely holding steady contact. The confident father who had stood on his driveway for television cameras, insisting he wanted his family back, was shrinking into someone else entirely, a man cornered, a man running out of control. Tammy's methodical pacing added to the pressure. She spoke gently, even encouragingly, but her consistency was relentless. She didn't argue with Chris. She didn't accuse him directly. Instead, she calmly reminded him of the importance of honesty, and then asked the same devastating questions again. Chris, are you being truthful when you say you don't know where Shannon is? Did you physically cause her disappearance? Did you hurt your daughters in any way? Each cycle dug deeper. The machine tracked the physiological spikes, heart rate climbing, sweat increasing, breathing becoming irregular, but the true unraveling was psychological. Chris had come in believing he could perform, but the test left no room for performance. The wires turned every denial into a tell, every pause into evidence of strain. His nervous chuckles grew more pronounced as the session wore on. They were not laughs of confidence or humor. They arrived in the wrong places, spilling out after questions about whether he killed his children. To Tammy and to audiences later, those chuckles were chilling. They revealed a man desperate to release tension, to mask fear with sound that fooled no one. They were cracks in the facade, little bursts of panic leaking out. Chris tried to steady himself. At times, he shifted into an almost robotic calm, answering no in monotone, trying to flatten his voice into nothingness. But his body refused to comply. He rubbed his thighs compulsively, wiped his palms, adjusted his position in the chair over and over. His leg bounced faintly beneath the table. Each movement was a pacifying gesture, an unconscious attempt to soothe anxiety that kept climbing. The repetition wore him down. Liars often believe they can deliver one good denial, but a polygraph demands endurance. Each new round of questioning forces a guilty to carry the lie again, to balance it against what they said before, to push it out without a crack. It is exhausting. By the end of the sequence, Chris's no was no longer firm. It came slowly, softly, with the energy drained from it. For Tammy, the picture was clear. For the machine, the data was obvious. And for Chris, though he didn't realize it yet, the performance was over. The test had stripped him of the calm exterior he wore like armor. His body betrayed him again and again, And when the wires were finally removed, he looked smaller, diminished, as though the weight of the truth he carried had bent him inward. As the test neared its end, Chris looked exhausted. The wires were still attached, but it wasn't the equipment weighing him down. It was the performance. He had tried to project calm, tried to control his body, tried to master the machine. But the effort had drained him. His shoulders slumped forward, his voice thinned into monotone, and his answers lost conviction. He no longer sounded like a man insisting on truth. He sounded like a man clinging to a lie too heavy to hold. Tammy kept her tone steady, still calm, still professional. She asked a few more baseline questions to round out the session, but the damage was done. The spikes in Chris's physiology told the story. The endless self-soothing gestures told the story. The nervous chuckles told the story. His body had spoken more loudly than his words. At one point, as Tammy rearranged her notes, Chris shifted in his seat, exhaled heavily, and rubbed his face with both hands. It was the gesture of a man worn down. In that simple act, he revealed how much pressure he felt, how badly he wished to be free of the wires, of the questions, of the weight. It was also a moment that future audiences would replay endlessly. The visual of a man pretending to be calm, now stripped of that calmness, looking like a cornered animal rather than a grieving husband. For Chris, the relief of the test ending was brief. The wires would be removed, the equipment packed away. But the real impact was yet to come. The polygraph wasn't about charts and graphs of courtroom. It was about the confrontation that followed. When Tammy leaned across the table later and told him, "Chris, you did not pass the polygraph," that single statement would crush what remained of the performance. Other infamous cases have shown the same unraveling. Diane Downs, who shot her children and failed her polygraph, laughed nervously too. Gary Ridgway, the Green River killer, believed he could fool examiners, but the stress betrayed him. Drew Peterson, accused in the disappearance of his wife, tried the same tactics, only to crumble under scrutiny. Each of these suspects shared Chris's fatal mistake, believing performance could outmatch physiology. Each learned the same lesson: the body speaks louder than words. By the time Tammy detached the sensors from Chris's fingers, loosened the band around his chest, and removed the cuff from his arm, the outcome was already written. He sat back in the chair, rubbing his wrists as if the wires had left a mark. His expression was blank, his body slouched, his energy drained. He didn't realize it yet, but his collapse had already begun. The test hadn't just measured his stress. It had exposed it, magnified it, and captured it forever on camera. For those who would later watch the footage, this was the most chilling part. The denials were soft, the body language transparent, the nervous chuckles unforgettable. It was the picture of a man who thought he could lie his way through the most important performance of his life, and instead watched himself unravel in real time. The polygraph had done its job, not as science, but as psychology, not as evidence for a courtroom, but as a hammer to crack Chris Watts' fragile mask. When he walked into that room, he believed he could win. When he walked out, the mask of calm had already broken. The crack show. By the midpoint of the polygraph session, the mask Chris Watts had worn so carefully was already slipping. When he first entered the interrogation room, he tried to project calm. He greeted Tammy Lee with a faint smile, spoke softly, and assured her he would do just fine. But as the questions circled back to the disappearance of Sean and the girls, that thin veneer began to crumble. What looked like calmness at first now revealed itself as strain. The cracks were showing. Chris had always been known as the quiet one. Friends described him as reserved, someone who faded into the background beside Shanann's bright, outgoing personality. On his driveway, speaking to television cameras, that same quietness had seemed unsettling. He rocked on his feet, arms crossed, voice flat. He had told reporters he wanted his family home, but he didn't look like a man in panic. He looked like a man reading from a script. Inside the polygraph chair, that detachment deepened into something harder to disguise. His silence wasn't strength. It was collapse. Tammy asked the questions again. Did you physically cause Shanann's disappearance? Did you harm your daughters in any way? Are you being truthful about not knowing where they are? At first, Chris tried to keep pace. His no responses came quickly, lips sealing shut after each one. But repetition wears on the guilty. Every cycle demands that they reconstruct a lie, measure it against what they said before, and deliver it without cracks. Innocent people don't feel this weight. They can repeat the truth endlessly, with the same tone each time. Chris couldn't. By the third or fourth round, the changes were visible. His denials came slower. He hesitated before answering, his throat working visibly as he swallowed. His voice lost its firmness, flattening into near whispers. His shoulders slumped further with each cycle, his posture collapsing inward. He avoided Tammy's eyes, looking down at the table or off to the side. His answers sounded less like conviction and more like exhaustion. His body betrayed him even more loudly than his voice. He rubbed his palms constantly against his thighs, leaving faint streaks of moisture on his pants. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward then back, adjusting as if the chair had turned hostile. He touched his face, wiped his mouth, scratched his neck, small, compulsive gestures known as pacifying behaviors, unconscious attempt to self-soothe when under stress. His lips dried out, and he licked them again and again until the skin around them grew irritated. Perhaps most disturbing were the chuckles. They slipped out in the silences after his answers, weak little laughs at the worst possible moments. Asked if he had harmed his children. He said no, then chuckled softly, nervously. Asked if he knew where Shannon was. He denied it, then let out another inappropriate laugh. These chuckles weren't signs of confidence. They were eruptions of tension, bursts of stress leaking through his performance. To Tammy, they were confirmation. To audiences later, they became some of the most haunting parts of the footage. Tammy used silence as a weapon. She didn't rush to fill the air after his answers. She let the seconds stretch, the quiet thickening until Chris fidgeted, rubbed his hands, or chuckled nervously just to break it. Silence in interrogation is never neutral. It is pressure. It demands filling, and in filling it, suspects reveal themselves. Chris filled the silence with guilt. By now, the room's energy had changed. The confident man who had told neighbors he wanted his family back, who had stood on his porch pretending to be the desperate husband, was gone. In his place sat a drained figure, eyes lowered, posture collapsed, denial soft and unconvincing. The cracks in his performance had widened into fractures. The polygraph wasn't finished yet, but Chris had already lost. For viewers who would later study the footage frame by frame, this was the part of the test that stood out the most. Chris was no longer simply denying. He was deteriorating. The cracks in his mask became obvious to anyone who knew how to watch. His responses grew slower. His gestures multiplied. His control slipped further with each passing minute. It was a slow motion unraveling a man who thought he could hold steady against the weight of truth. Tammy Lee, though calm and professional, was no passive observer. She guided the session with surgical precision. Every repeated question, every pause, every moment of silence was intentional. She didn't rush to corner him. She allowed him to collapse on his own. She knew the polygraph itself was less important than what it did to his mind. The wires weren't there to prove guilt in a courtroom. They were there to make Chris believe he'd been caught, to magnify his stress until it spilled out through every pore. And it worked. Chris's hands, once resting stiffly in his lap, now moved constantly. He rubbed his thighs, clenched and unclenched his fingers, wiped sweat on the fabric of his jeans. His lips pressed together after each no, sealing the word like a secret. At times, his breathing shifted suddenly, the band across his chest tightening with each uneven inhale. His eyes betrayed him too, darting down, glancing to the side, rarely meeting Tammy's gaze. Then there were the chuckles. They arrived in bursts, sudden and misplaced. Asked about his daughters, Chris said no, then laughed weakly, his voice cracking into a nervous chuckle. Asked if he knew where Shannon was, he denied it, then smiled faintly and laughed again, as though the absurdity of the question amused him. But these weren't signs of amusement. They were the body's way of releasing tension it could no longer hold. They chilled the room. Body language experts would later analyze these moments in depth. They called them duping delight, a term for when liars smile or laugh because they believe they're getting away with deception. Others suggested they were nervous tics, Unconscious leaks of guilt. Whatever the explanation, the effect was the same. Chris looked wrong. Not grieving, not indignant, not even defensive, just wrong. This was a turning point for many who would watch the footage online. In the weeks and months after his arrest, clips of the polygraph spread widely on YouTube, each one dissected in slow motion. Viewers replayed the lip licks, the nervous chuckles, the shifting posture. They compared the behavior to other infamous liars caught on camera. Scott Peterson with his cold attachment, Diane Downs with her performative charm, Drew Peterson with his smug defiance. Chris fell somewhere in between, combining flat detachment with nervous leakage, a mixture of eerie calm and transparent stress. The most unnerving part was how ordinary he looked while lying. He didn't scream, didn't flail, didn't collapse into sobs. He just sat there, quietly answering no, even as his body screamed yes. That ordinariness made it all the more chilling. He wasn't a monster raging in a cell. He was a man in a collared shirt, speaking softly, betraying himself one breath at a time. As the session dragged on, his energy drained. His shoulders slouched further. His hands slowed in their movements, not because he was calm, but because fatigue was setting in. Lying under that kind of pressure takes effort, and Chris was running out of strength. His denial sounded empty, hollow echoes of the script he had rehearsed. His mask of calm, once carefully maintained, now hung loosely, cracked at every edge. By the time Tammy wrapped up the last round of questions, the collapse was undeniable. Chris had walked into the room with the illusion of control. He left the test drained, diminished, visibly weighed down by the stress of holding up his lies. The cracks had become fractures, and soon they would split wide open. When the final round of questions ended, Chris exhaled heavily, as though he had been holding his breath for the entire session. The wires were still strapped across his chest. The sensor still clipped his fingers. But the real restraint was no longer physical. It was psychological. He had tried to control the test, tried to master his own body. But the effort had drained him. His face sagged, his shoulders slouched. His voice was nearly gone. Tammy shuffled her papers quietly, giving him no relief, no signal of how he had done. The silence was suffocating. Chris rubbed his palms along his thighs again, wiped his mouth, and laughed softly, another nervous chuckle at a moment when laughter had no place. It was the sound of a man desperately trying to release tension, even as the room closed and tighter around him. For the investigators watching, the session had already served its purpose. They didn't need the charts and graphs to tell them what they could see with their own eyes. Chris was unraveling. His body language screamed guilt. His voice had lost conviction. The calmness he had carried in was gone, replaced by the visible exhaustion of a man who could no longer hold his mask in place. The ending of the test marked the beginning of the collapse. Chris looked smaller in the chair, diminished by the weight of his own lies. His denials no longer sounded like protection. They sounded like surrender. And when Tammy finally unstrapped the chest band, unclipped the sensors, and loosened the cuff, he rubbed his wrists as though the equipment had left bruises. But the marks weren't from the wires. They were from the pressure of his own deception. This was the moment that future audiences would replay endlessly. On YouTube, in documentaries and body language analysis videos, millions would watch Chris's subtle betrayals. The chuckles, the lip licks, the shifting posture, the slumping shoulders. They would slow the footage down, frame by frame, pointing out each crack in the mask. They would compare to other famous liars caught on camera. Scott Peterson's cold attachment, Diane Downs' exaggerated charm, Ted Bundy's smug confidence. Chris's nervous collapse fit into that grim lineage. Another case study of how the body refuses to keep secrets. What made it unforgettable was its ordinariness. Chris didn't explode, didn't cry, didn't rage. He simply sat there, answering softly, quietly, while his body betrayed him. That quietness, that flatness, made the collapse even more chilling. He wasn't a monster snarling behind bars. He was a man in a collared shirt, speaking softly, unraveling in real time. The horror lay in the contrast, the everyday mask of normalcy breaking under the weight of an unthinkable crime. By the time Tammy ended the session, the transformation was complete. Chris once had entered the room as a man, insisting on his innocence. He left it drained, diminished, Cracked wide open, the polygraph hadn't just recorded his stress. It had exposed it, magnified it, and captured it forever on camera. And though Chris didn't yet know it, the next step would be even worse. Because once Tammy returned with the results, the mask wouldn't just crack, it would shatter. The results. The polygraph session ended with a quiet shuffle of papers and the unhooking of wires. For Chris Watts, the physical relief of being released from the machine was fleeting. He rubbed his wrist where the sensors had been, exhaled sharply, and tried to collect himself. But the damage was already done. His body had betrayed him, and Tammy Lee, the examiner, had seen it all. When she re-entered the room a short while later, her demeanor had shifted. She was no longer the warm, chatty examiner who had joked about how nobody likes these things. She now carried the quiet authority of someone holding the truth in her hands. Chris sat up slightly straighter, as if bracing for impact. "Chris," she said firmly, looking him directly in the eye, "you did not pass the polygraph." The words hit him like a blow. He froze. His lips parted slightly, then closed again. His eyes blinked rapidly, searching for an escape in the silence. Then came the nervous laugh, that hollow, inappropriate chuckle that had peppered his answers throughout the test. It sounded weaker now, more desperate, as though he could laugh his way out of the truth closing in. Did I fail completely?" he asked, his voice small, uncertain. Tammy didn't soften. She explained calmly but firmly that his answers had shown deception, that the machine had picked up on physiological responses inconsistent with truth. She told him this was his opportunity to be honest, to explain what had really happened. The room grew heavier with every word. Chris shifted in his seat, rubbing his hands together, eyes darting downward. He chuckled again, a faint, awkward sound that hung in the air. His posture slumped, his shoulders sagging inward. The confident mask he had worn for days, on his driveway for reporters, inside his home for neighbors, even in this very room at the start of the test, was gone. Detectives joined Tammy, reinforcing the blow. They told him directly, "You lied. The polygraph shows it." They didn't give him room to argue. They framed the result as absolute. It wasn't about science anymore. It was about psychology. The polygraph wasn't admissible evidence in court, but it was devastating leverage in the interrogation room. Chris tried weakly to protest. I didn't hurt them." His words trailed off, thin and unconvincing. He wiped his palms again, looked away, swallowed hard. The room pressed in tighter. This moment, captured forever on video, became iconic because it revealed the exact second Chris Watts' illusion collapsed. For days, he had convinced neighbors and media outlets that he was the grieving husband, the father desperate for his family's return. But in that instant, with Tammy's calm words stripping him of his last offense, he transformed in front of the camera. He was no longer the victim. He was a liar caught in the act. Chris sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the table. The words, "You didn't pass," echoed in the room like a sentence being read aloud. His posture shrank further, as if he wanted to fold himself into the chair and disappear. The nervous chuckle surfaced again, weaker this time, more like a reflex than an attempt at composure. It was a laugh of a man who had no more tools left. Tammy leaned in slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Chris, this is a time to be honest. This is your opportunity. The polygraph shows deception, and I can tell you were not truthful in your answers." She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She simply stated the result as fact, leaving him no room to debate. Detectives joined in, amplifying the psychological weight. They reminded him that the polygraph wasn't wrong, that it was clear he had lied. They told him they needed the truth, not another denial. The technique was deliberate. Strip away the possibility of doubt, close every escape route, and corner him in the only place left, confession. Chris rubbed his hands together, then pressed his palms flat against his thighs. He stared at the floor, his jaw tightening. He muttered again, "I didn't hurt them," but the words sounded empty, hollow. Even he seemed to know they no longer carried weight. His voice had lost the edge of denial. It carried the exhaustion of surrender. This was the moment when his public mask finally shattered. On his driveway, Chris had performed grief for the cameras, crossing his arms as he told reporters he just wanted his family back. In the polygraph chair, he had tried to perform calmness, answering softly, chuckling nervously, pretending control. But here, confronted with failure, there was no performance left. He was just a man caught, stripped of the illusion of innocence. The footage of this exact moment will become one of the most replayed clips in modern true crime. Millions of viewers on YouTube, documentaries, and news specials would study the look on his face when Tammy told him he had failed. They would dissect the nervous laugh, the sagging shoulders, the way his eyes blinked too fast, the slump of his posture. It was a precise second his facade collapsed, the instant the grieving husband became the guilty liar. For detectives, it was a breakthrough. For Chris, it was the beginning of the end. The declaration of failure was more than just a statement about charts and graphs. It was a carefully crafted blow to Chris Watts' fragile performance. Tammy and the detectives didn't present the polygraph as something that could be debated. They didn't say, "It looks like you may have failed." They told him flatly, "You failed." The power of that certainty was devastating. Polygraphs may not hold weight in courtrooms, but in interrogation rooms, their psychological impact is immense. By framing the result as absolute, detectives stripped Chris of the last offense he could cling to: doubt. There was no space left to argue, no room to hide. In his mind, the machine had spoken, and it had branded him a liar. Detectives seized a moment. They leaned in, not with anger, but with persistence. They told him this was his chance to come clean. They offered him lifelines, suggesting possibilities that made him look less monstrous. Maybe Shannon had hurt the girls, they said. Maybe he had reacted in the heat of the moment. Maybe he wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but a desperate father making a terrible mistake. The strategy was deliberate. By giving him an out, they made confession seem like relief instead of destruction. Chris shifted in his chair, eyes fixed on the table. His voice trembled. I didn't hurt them." But the words carried no conviction. He rubbed his palms again, chuckled weakly, swallowed hard. His body screamed surrender even as his mouth whispered denial. For audiences who would later watch this footage, it was riveting. They saw the precise moment a liar collapsed under pressure. They saw the nervous laugh, the hunched posture, the empty words. They saw the transition from a man insisting on innocence to a man cornered by truth. The clip spread across YouTube and documentaries, replayed endlessly as a case study in deception unraveling. It became one of the most iconic true crime moments of the decade, not because of the polygraph science, but because of the human drama it captured. A man caught in his own lies, breaking in real time. The grieving husband of yesterday was gone. What remained was a diminished figure, stripped of his mask, standing at the edge of confession. The results of the polygraph didn't end the investigation, but they ended Chris's illusion. From that moment forward, detectives knew he was guilty, and the world, watching through released footage, will remember forever the look on his face when Tammy said the words, "Chris, you did not pass the polygraph." Breakdown and interrogation. The words still hung in the air. "Chris, you did not pass the polygraph." That single line was the crack that split his carefully constructed mask. But detectives knew the polygraph itself wasn't the end game. It was a lever, the wedge they needed to pry him open. What came next, the interrogation, would take those cracks and widen them until the entire facade shattered. Chris sat hunched at the table, hands folded in front of him, staring down at the wood grain as if it held answers he could not give. The nervous chuckle his old companion slipped out again, faint and misplaced. He rubbed his palms against his jeans, then folded his arms tightly across his chest, as if bracing against an invisible storm. Tammy leaned forward, her voice calm but firmer now. "This is the time to be honest, Chris. This is your chance. We know you weren't truthful on that test, and we need to know what really happened." Detective Graham Coder joined her, his tone steady but persuasive. "Chris, listen. People make mistakes. Things happen in the heat of the moment, but what we need from you is the truth. Right now, you're the only one who can tell us. This was a shift, the move from questioning to confrontation, from gentle rapport to applied pressure. They didn't scream. They didn't slam fists on the table. They didn't have to. The polygraph result had already softened him, and now they only needed to push. Chris shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed downward. I didn't hurt them, he muttered, the words barely audible. But even as he spoke, he rubbed his thighs again, chuckled weakly, swallowed hard. His body betrayed what his voice tried to deny. The detectives introduced minimization, one of the most powerful tools in interrogation. They suggested scenarios that painted him in a less monstrous light. Chris, maybe Sean did something to the girls, and you reacted. Maybe you lost control for just a moment. That doesn't make you a bad guy forever. That makes you human. But hiding it, that makes things worse. The offer of a softer version of events dangled in front of him like a lifeline. For guilty suspects, minimization provides an escape from the unbearable weight of full confession. It allows them to dip a toe into admission without plunging into the abyss. Chris reached for it. He shifted in his seat, his voice trembling. I don't know what happened, he whispered, still clinging to denial. But the detectives pressed harder, repeating the minimization, offering him that path again. If Sean hurt the girls, Chris, we need to know. We can help you if you're honest. At last, he cracked. She hurt them, he muttered, his voice breaking slightly. And then I lost it. It was a lie, but it was the first time he admitted violence. The dam had broken. Chris's words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of collapse. She hurt them, and then I lost it. For the detectives, this was the opening they had been working toward. They didn't stop him. They didn't correct the lie. Instead, they leaned into it, giving him room to keep talking. In interrogation, the first crack is rarely the full truth. It's usually a half step, a distorted version of events that allows the suspect to confess while still protecting their self-image. For Chris, blaming Sean was his lifeline. It let him admit something terrible had happened without painting himself as a monster. Tammy's voice softened again, coaxing him forward. Chris, help us understand. What did you see? What did she do? Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was almost sympathetic, as though she were giving him permission to share the unbearable. Chris leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table, his hands clasped together. His voice trembled as he spoke. I saw her. She was on top of Celeste. I don't know what came over me. I just lost it. The detectives nodded slowly, reinforcing his version. They weren't confirming it as truth, but they allowed him to settle into it, to feel safe enough to keep talking. This is a hallmark of effective interrogation. Meet the suspect where they are, even if the first story is a lie, and use it as a bridge to the full confession. For Chris, this halfway admission was devastating enough. His mask had slipped completely. No longer was he the grieving husband searching for his missing family. Now, in his own words, he was a man admitting violence had taken place in his home. Whether or not his story was true, the line had been crossed. He had acknowledged death. Viewers who later watched the footage found this moment chilling. It wasn't just the content of his words. It was the way he said them. His voice was flat, drained of emotion. There was no outrage at Sean supposedly harming the girls, no grief, no tears. Just a quiet monotone, punctuated by nervous chuckles and self-soothing gestures. The story didn't fit the behavior. It rang hollow. Detectives knew it too. They didn't challenge him outright, but their questions gently probed at the inconsistencies. Chris, are you sure that's how it happened? Are you protecting Sean right now, when really this was you? They offered him more lifelines, more softened scenarios. Each one chipped away at the lie he had just built. By now, Chris was slumped low in the chair, his hands limp on the table. His energy was gone. The polygraph had broken his mask. The interrogation was tearing apart what remained. The breakdown wasn't explosive. It was slow, steady, inevitable. Chris's first false confession, blaming Sean, was the moment detectives had been waiting for. He had crossed the threshold. He had admitted something terrible had happened inside that house, even if his version twisted the truth. For investigators, that was enough to keep pressing. They didn't stop him. They didn't confront the lie immediately. They let him speak, let him build the narrative, because every word bound him tighter to guilt. He described, in halting phrases, how he had supposedly walked into the bedroom and found Shannon over one of the girls. He claimed he just reacted. His words painted himself as a man pushed into violence, not as a cold-blooded killer. It was a story of a desperate father avenging his children, not the reality of a man erasing his family for freedom. But the detectives didn't interrupt. They nodded gently, asked clarifying questions, encouraged him to continue. "Tell us what you saw, Chris. Help us understand what happened," Tammy coaxed. Chris hunched forward, his hands wringing each other. She was hurting them. "And I lost it. I lost it." His voice was barely above a whisper, trembling at the edges. The words hung in the air like smoke, thin and insubstantial. For audiences who would later watch this interrogation, the hollowness of his confession was striking. His tone carried no outrage, no grief, no anger. If Shannon had truly harmed their daughters, a husband and father would likely react with shock, with anguish, with fury. Chris showed none of that. He was flat, drained, monotone. His confession didn't sound like the release of a tormented truth. It sounded like the construction of a new lie, built in desperation to survive the pressure. Detectives recognized this too. They didn't call him out immediately. Instead, they let him cling to the story, because the act of confessing, even falsely, was progress. Each step deeper into this invented narrative made it harder for him to climb back out. Each word he spoke tied him more firmly to admission of guilt. And then came the turning point, the request for his father. Chris asked to speak with Ronnie Watts, who had been waiting at the station. The detectives agreed. It was another calculated move. They knew that suspects often feel safer confessing to loved ones, and whatever Chris revealed his father could be used to deepen the case. When Ronnie entered the room, Chris crumbled further. He spoke haltingly, head bowed, voice breaking into weak mutters. "Dad, I killed her." The words tumbled out, followed by the half-truth about Shannon. She hurt the girls, and then his father, sat in stunned silence, trying to comfort him even as the weight of the admission sank in. The room was heavy with betrayal and confusion. Detectives allowed it, listening as Chris laid out his fractured version of events. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was confession enough. The grieving husband act was over. The man who had pleaded on his driveway for his family's safe return was gone. In his place sat a confessed killer. However distorted the details might be, this was the breakdown in interrogation. It wasn't a sudden explosion, not a shouted admission, not a dramatic collapse. It was a slow erosion, a man worn down by pressure, by silence, by the weight of his own body's betrayal. It was the image of a mass crumbling piece by piece until nothing remained. For law enforcement, it was textbook. For true crime audiences, it was unforgettable. Chris Watts had walked into that station, insisting he was innocent. He walked out as a confessed murderer. The polygraph had cracked his mask. The interrogation had broken it completely. Why the polygraph mattered. Polygraphs are not science in the courtroom sense. They don't detect lies directly. They measure physiological responses, heart rate, breathing, sweat, and infer deception from spikes in stress. Courts reject them because anxiety can mimic dishonesty. A person terrified but innocent may fail. A person cold-blooded and practice may pass. The machine is not a lie detector. And yet, in the interrogation room, it holds a different kind of power. Psychological. Chris Watts' case is a perfect example. The polygraph itself didn't send him to prison. No judge ever looked at the charts. No jury ever saw the graphs. But the test mattered profoundly. It mattered because of what it did to Chris and what it gave detectives. When Chris agreed to take the polygraph, he made his first fatal mistake. Most guilty suspects refuse. They say it's unreliable. They demand an attorney. They brush it off as a waste of time. But Chris, desperate to look cooperative, said yes. He believed he could control his breathing, regulate his pulse, and trick the system. He thought he could beat both the machine and the examiner. What he didn't realize was that saying yes put him into a trap he couldn't escape. The moment he failed, detectives could confront him with certainty. The machine says you lied. It didn't matter if the science was debated. What mattered was the impact of those words on Chris's fragile performance. His entire mask was built on the illusion of calm, on the belief that he could appear innocent. When Tammy leaned in and told him he had failed, that illusion shattered. He couldn't argue his way out. He couldn't chuckle it off. The test had stripped him bare. The psychological power of polygraphs lies in exactly this dynamic. They create an authority outside the suspect's control. The suspect can deny detectives, argue with evidence, insist on alternative explanations. But how do you argue with your own body? How do you claim innocence when a machine has proven you guilty? For many, the weight of that framing is crushing. For Chris, it was a breaking point. For Chris, the failed polygraph was more than an interrogation tactic. It was a turning point of the entire case. Until that moment, he had managed to live in two realities at once. In one, he was the grieving husband on the news, pleading for his family's safe return. In the other, he was a man who had buried them in shallow graves and hidden their bodies in oil tanks. The polygraph fused those realities together, tearing away the mask he had worn in public and confronting him with the truth he had buried in private. Polygraphs aren't foolproof, but their strength lies in how suspects perceive them. For someone like Chris, the belief that the machine could prove his lies was enough to crush his defenses. Once Tammy said, "You didn't pass," his performance collapsed. His denials lost conviction. His posture slumped. His chuckles sounded desperate instead of controlled. The certainty of failure stripped him of every escape route. Law enforcement has long understood this dynamic. The polygraph isn't really about evidence. It's about leverage. It gives detectives a weapon they can wield with authority. By telling suspect a machine has caught them lying, they create a psychological corner that's almost impossible to escape. For some, it triggers full confessions. For others, like Chris, it leads to fractured admissions that can be pressed further in interrogation. Either way, it breaks the illusion of control. Other cases highlight the same pattern. Diane Downs, who shot her own children in 1983, laughed during her polygraph session, a nervous, inappropriate laugh that echoed Chris's chuckles decades later. The test didn't convict her, but it exposed her deception and gave detectives the confidence to push harder. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, also believed he could fool examiners, but the stress of testing only confirmed suspicions and deepened the case against him. Drew Peterson, accused in the disappearance of his wife, displayed smug confidence during his polygraph, only to unravel when confronted with his deceptive results. Each of these suspects shared Chris's fatal flaw: overconfidence in their ability to control the uncontrollable. Chris once fit the pattern exactly. He thought his quiet demeanor would mask his guilt, that by breathing steadily and answering softly, he could outsmart the machine. Instead, his nervous chuckles, restless gestures, and uneven breathing betrayed him. The polygraph amplified those betrayals, magnifying them until even Chris himself could no longer deny them. For audiences watching years later, the failed test became more than just a moment in an investigation. It became a cultural artifact. The scene replayed in documentaries, dissected by body language experts on YouTube, analyzed by millions fascinated with the psychology of deception. Viewers slowed the footage down, studying every twitch, every lip lick, every nervous laugh. They weren't watching a machine catch lies. They were watching a human being collapse under the weight of his own secrets. The irony is that Chris could have refused. He could have said no to the test, and detectives would have had to continue building their case without it. But by agreeing, he sealed his fate. His own need to appear cooperative destroyed him. His performance in that chair, the nervous chuckles, the restless shifting, the flat denials, will forever be remembered as the moment the mask slipped, the moment the grieving husband became the exposed liar. In the end, the polygraph mattered not because of science, but because of psychology. It didn't prove guilt in court. It proved weakness in Chris. And once that weakness was exposed, the rest of the case unfolded like dominoes. The machine may not have convicted him, but it broke him, and that break was all detectives needed. The legacy of the polygraph moment. The failed polygraph of Chris Watts was more than a tactical step in an interrogation. It became a cultural moment, a piece of footage that transcended the case itself and entered the collective memory of true crime history. People didn't remember the charts or the numbers. They remembered the man in the chair, quiet, soft-spoken, wires strapped across his body, nervously chuckling as he denied killing his wife and children. That image seared itself into the public imagination, not because it proved guilt in the courtroom, but because it showed guilt breaking in real time. Within days of Chris's arrest, clips of the polygraph session began circulating online. News broadcasts replayed the footage of Tammy Lee telling him, "You did not pass the polygraph." On YouTube, body language analysts slowed the video down, pointing to every lip lick, every nervous laugh, every glance downward. Forums lit up with debates about whether Chris's chuckles were signs of duping delight, the strange thrill liars sometimes feel when they think they're getting away with deception, or whether they were nervous reflexes, the body's attempt to release unbearable tension. Either way, audiences couldn't look away. The clip took on a life of its own. Documentaries devoted entire segments to it, presenting it as a pivotal moment when the mask of innocence shattered. In classrooms for law enforcement, instructors began showing the footage to new detectives, pointing out the psychology at play, how repetition wears down liars, how silence forces suspects to fidget, how the certainty of a failed test crushes confidence. Chris Watts' polygraph became a case study in the art of interrogation, a textbook example of how the human body betrays deception. For viewers at home, though, the fascination was more primal. Watching the footage was like watching a facade peel away in slow motion. Chris had stood on his driveway just hours earlier, telling reporters he wanted his family back, his arms folded protectively across his chest, his voice flat but steady. He had fooled some people, at least for a moment. But in the polygraph room, there was no driveway, no camera crew, no control. There was just a man unraveling, frame by frame, denial by denial. Chris Watts' failed polygraph didn't exist in a vacuum. It became part of a larger cultural fascination with moments when a mask slips, those raw instances when liars are caught in real time and their bodies betray them. Psychologists call this leakage, the unintentional display of hidden emotions that contradict what someone is trying to present. In Chris's case, the leakage was obvious. The nervous chuckles, the lip licks, the restless fidgeting, the flat denials that grew weaker over time. Audiences are drawn to this kind of footage because it reveals a universal truth. No matter how carefully people try to control themselves, their bodies often speak louder than their words. Watching Chris unravel wasn't just about his guilt. It was about witnessing the limits of human performance under stress. People rewatch the footage not because they doubt the outcome, but because they are fascinated by how the cracks spread across his demeanor until the mask shattered completely. Other infamous suspects highlight the same dynamic. Jodi Arias, accused of murdering her boyfriend Travis Alexander, gave interviews and testimony filled with odd smiles and inconsistent stories. Her body language, like Chris's, became a focus for analysts who dissected every gesture. Casey Anthony, tried for the death of her daughter Kaylee, sat in court with a detached demeanor that many found chilling, her calmness contrasting sharply with the horror of the crime. Scott Peterson, convicted of murdering his wife Lacey and their unborn son, displayed the same eerie flatness Chris showed, an emotional void that unsettled observers more than open displays of anger would have. In each case, the fascination came not just from the crimes themselves, but from watching the accused under pressure. People wanted to see the moment when the truth peeked through, when the body slipped and revealed what the words tried to hide. Chris Watts' polygraph was one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon, which is why it has endured as one of the most replayed clips in true crime history. True crime creators and communities amplified this fascination. On YouTube, countless videos slowed down the footage, zooming in on Chris's lips as he licked them, or replaying his nervous laugh after denying harm to his children. Forums debated whether his flat tone showed sociopathy or simply exhaustion. TikTok users stitched together short clips of his chuckles, pairing them with captions about guilt leaking out. In these communities, the polygraph clip became a cultural shorthand for the moment the mask slipped. But alongside fascination came discomfort. Many viewers admitted they rewatched the footage compulsively, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't look away. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, horrifying and magnetic at once. Psychologists suggest that compulsion comes from our survival instincts. Humans are wired to detect deception, to notice microsignals of dishonesty, because in our evolutionary past, detecting lies could mean life or death. Watching Chris in that chair tapped into that ancient instinct, holding viewers captive as they search for the tiny giveaways in his performance. The comparisons, the rewatches, the endless commentary, all built into a legacy far bigger than the polygraph itself. Chris Watts' failed test wasn't important in court, but it became a mirror for society's obsession with truth, lies, and the human body's inability to keep secrets. For the true crime community, Chris Watts' failed polygraph became more than evidence. It became content. Creators clipped and re-uploaded the footage, pairing it with voiceover analyses, captions, and commentary. Body language experts highlighted his pacifying gestures. Forensic psychologists explained the impact of silence and minimization, and ordinary viewers debated endlessly whether his nervous chuckles reflected arrogance, guilt, or something darker. The interrogation room, once meant only for investigators and suspects, became a theater stage replayed across millions of screens. This obsession speaks to something deeper in our culture. Audiences aren't only fascinated by crimes themselves, they're fascinated by the performance of guilt. Watching someone unravel is like watching a magic trick in reverse. The illusion falls apart and the truth is revealed. Chris's polygraph collapse became the ultimate example of this. Viewers didn't need charts or numbers. They could see it in his slumped shoulders, his faltering denials, his hollow laugh. They could witness in real time the moment a facade dissolved. Yet the legacy is not without cost. For Shanann's family, this footage is agony. Every replay, every commentary, every viral clip is a reminder not of abstract psychology, but of personal loss. To them, Chris's chuckle isn't just a nervous laugh. It's the sound of the man who murdered their daughter and grandchildren, while millions dissect his behavior as though it were entertainment. Shanann's parents and friends saw it as trauma replayed endlessly in public. The polygraph footage may fascinate strangers, but for the family, it is another wound. Still, the lesson of the polygraph endures. It shows how fragile deception is under pressure, how even the calmest facade eventually cracks. Chris once believed he could control his body, his breathing, his story. He thought he could outweigh a machine and outlast trained interrogators. Instead, his body betrayed him, and his need to appear innocent became the very thing that destroyed him. Other suspects will face polygraphs. Other interrogation clips will surface. But Chris's polygraph collapse has already secured its place in true crime history, not because of what it proved legally, but because of what it revealed humanly. The universal truth that no mask, no matter how carefully maintained, can hold forever. Final thoughts. At the end of the day, Chris Watts' failed polygraph is not remembered for its scientific accuracy. It's remembered because it captured the unraveling of a man who thought he could maintain control. Sitting in that chair, wires strapped across his body, he tried to perform calmness. He smiled weakly, chuckled nervously, whispered denials. But the truth leaked through his every gesture. His mask cracked, then shattered, and the world watched it happen in real time. The polygraph didn't convict him in court. What convicted him were the confessions that followed, the physical evidence, the discovery of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. But the polygraph mattered because it was a hinge point. The moment the grieving husband persona collapsed, the moment the investigation pivoted from suspicion to confession. It showed how fragile deception is under pressure, how even the most ordinary man can unravel when confronted with the weight of his own lies. For true crime audiences, this footage endures because it embodies a universal truth. The body betrays what the mind tries to conceal. Chris's chuckles, his restless hands, his slumped shoulders all revealed more than his words ever could. That's why millions continue to rewatch the footage, not for the science, But for psychology, it reminds us that no mask can hold forever. But beyond the fascination lies tragedy. For Shanann's family, this isn't just a cultural artifact or a YouTube clip. It's a reminder of betrayal, a reminder that the man they welcomed into their lives murdered the very people he was supposed to protect. Every replay, every analysis, every slowed-down chuckle is another reopening of wounds that will never fully heal. So what do we as viewers take from this? Do we consume it as entertainment? Or do we let it force us to reflect on the illusions we choose to believe, the red flags we sometimes ignore, the fragile line between ordinary lives and unthinkable violence? The story of Chris Watts is not just about one man's lies. It is about the danger of masks, the psychology of control, and the way truth always forces itself to the surface. His polygraph collapse remains one of the clearest reminders that the human body, under stress, tells a story all its own. If this case made you reflect, if it made you think about the psychology of lies and the chilling reality behind calm facades, I invite you to stay with me on this journey. On this channel, Dark Truths, True Crime Stories, we go beyond headlines. We dig into psychology, the family dynamics, the cracks in the mask that reveal the darkest truths. Don't forget to like this video if it gave you insight. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next deep dive. And if you'd like to support this work further, consider joining as a channel member. It helps keep these stories alive and allows me to bring you longer, more detailed documentaries like this one. And when you're done here, check out my other videos. From Collapse of Scott Peterson's story, to comparisons between Chris Watts and other family annihilators, to cases where deception cracked wide open under pressure. Because at the end of every case, one question remains. When the mask slips, what will be revealed? Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop searching for the dark truths behind the stories we think we know.